walking us through a series on the life of Joseph. And it's been a wonderful summer to be able to do that. We've got 2 weeks left in our series. And one of the things that my wife and I have been doing this summer, which is really fun when you have teenage kids and everyone kind of stays up later and you're not worried about school in the morning, is that we've been walking down to Burbank Library and picking out old movies from like our childhood, and that our kids have never seen, that aren't on streaming, like old films, like from the late 90s, just like really old, almost black and white, and making our kids watch them, and just dealing with all the laughter they have about the bad CGI and all that kind of stuff, special effects. But my favorite is to kind of pick out those films that have those like twists, those surprise endings, and to watch them again, knowing how it's all going to end, and all of a sudden find yourself now catching all these little details that you're like, how did I miss that the first time? So I've been on like an M. Night Shyamalan kick, and so Jackson and I recently watched Signs. And I remember Signs was shot in Montgomery County where my mom and dad and stepdad were living at the time. And so I've always kind of been drawn to that and watching it again with him and just picking up all these little details, like the little girl who leaves out her glasses of water everywhere because she says they're dirty, but she doesn't want to clean them up. And then the older brother who gave up his dream to play baseball to help out the family, and he literally retired his bat and they hung it up on the wall. And the mother who dies tragically in this car accident and has this incredible last word to her husband where she says, tell our son to swing away. And you're watching all this thinking like, wow, what odd details to put in. And then in the final scene, you realize all of this comes together and this alien is in the house. And, spoiler alert, the film's 30 years old. There's an alien in the house and the aliens can't handle water, right? And so all of a sudden, swing away becomes a code to grab the bat and smash all the glasses of water and to kill the alien, And, when it's coming, it's kind of like fun to see the buildup. And, of course, Jackson has this like crazy prophetic gift we've decided where he like guesses the ends of films, with like 30 minutes. He's like, no, it's the water. The water's going to kill it. I'm like, well, you're ruining it for everyone else. Come on. But it's fun to kind of, when you know how a story is going to end, to be able to appreciate along the way all of the little details in the lives of the characters that are preparing them for that crisis moment. And that's really where we are today in the life of Joseph. We are at the end of Joseph's life, and yet we know how this whole story started. And in a sense, even today, we're able to reinterpret his entire life based on the ending. We have gone through 13 chapters in the book of Genesis, covering nearly 30 years of Joseph's life so far. And today, finally, the story will conclude. Joseph will actually pass away and be buried at the end of our text. And we have the privilege of reviewing his life from beginning to end. And the best part of that is that we can appreciate kind of the story that God has been writing, this redemption story that it was impossible for Joseph to ever appreciate as he was living it. All of the little details in his life that felt random and extraneous and maybe even problematic, we can now appreciate were part of what God was doing to weave together this story. We have the perspective at the end that we lacked at the beginning, which is that God was working all along the way. In the in-between of the beginning and the end, God was working to ultimately save thousands of lives in this land. If you're new today, just to catch you up briefly, kind of a flashback, we've been looking at the life of Joseph. He's the favored son of 12 boys born to a man named Jacob. And early on in his life, one day when he was a young teenager, he had 2 dreams. And in both dreams, his older brothers and his parents were bowing down before him. And that he viewed those dreams as being from God, being prophetic, as kind of pointing to a future when one day he would go from being one of the youngest and, kind of picked on to ultimately being honored and submitted to by his big brothers. And you can imagine the pride that gave him as a younger child. But of course, that vision led his brothers to incredible jealousy, and they thought, who do you think you are that we're going to bow down before you? And so they initially thought to kill him by throwing him in a pit. And then one of the brothers, Reuben, showed a little bit of mercy and instead sold him into slavery. And so he ends up disappearing from their life. They think never to be seen again. He ends up in a prison in Egypt where he has a moment where he's able to interpret the dreams for 2 other prisoners. And that leads him eventually to a moment where he stands before Pharaoh and he interprets a dream for Pharaoh. And in Pharaoh's dream, he realizes that there are 7 years of feast and then 7 years of famine that are coming. And Pharaoh says, I'm putting you in charge. Your job is to prepare our nation so that we won't die when those years of famine come. And then last week we saw in this incredible twist of fate, not only is his life turned upside down, he's in the palace, but his brothers appear out of nowhere. His brothers hear in a distant land that the nation of Egypt is the only nation that has prepared for this famine, that they have grain, and so they come into his presence. They don't recognize him, but he recognizes them. And eventually, he reveals himself to them and then does something which is incredible for anyone who's ever been wounded deeply by someone in your family. He makes the choice to forgive them. And not only does he forgive them, but he invites them to go back and get his father and all of their wives and children and family and to come live under his protection in the nation of Egypt so that they will be prevented from starving. That's how the chapter 45 and 46 ended. We're going to skip through a couple chapters where Jacob blesses his children, each one of them individually, and gives them kind of a prophetic word for the course of their life. We'll skip that and we'll get right to the final chapter of Genesis 50. We'll start in verse 14. Jacob has just passed away. After burying his father, Joseph returned to Egypt together with his brothers and all the others who had gone with him to bury his father. And when Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all of the wrongs we did to him?" So they sent word to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father." And when their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves before him. "We are your slaves," they said. But Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them, and he spoke kindly to them. Joseph stayed in Egypt along with his father's family. He lived 110 years. He saw the third generation of Ephraim's children, and also the children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were placed at birth on Joseph's knees. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am about to die, but God will surely come to your aid and take you up out of this land to the land he promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob." And Joseph made the Israelites swear an oath and said, "God will surely come to your aid, and then you must carry my bones up from this place." So Joseph died at the age of 110, and after they had embalmed him, he was placed in a coffin in Egypt. In this final chapter of Genesis, as everything is kind of wrapping up, the patriarch Joseph dies, and then the brothers go back to doing what these brothers have been doing since the beginning. It's as if in that moment when they realize dad's gone, they all of a sudden fear for their lives again. And so they, even though they had an experience last week where they were forgiven, and Joseph wept 7 times and said, "I forgive you," they don't feel forgiven. Their guilty conscience still hangs with them. They know what they did, that they trafficked their brother into slavery years ago, and that at any moment their brother could snap and punish them, and so they're afraid to even be in his presence without their father's protection now, so they simply send a message. And the message says, "Hey, so right before dad died," like the last thing he said, it was just like it was like right there on his deathbed, he's like, "Hey, tell Joseph not to get revenge on the rest of you guys." Like I read pretty carefully through like the 4 chapters of Genesis we skipped. That's not in there, okay? Now, I'm not saying he didn't say it, but I'm just saying the character of these brothers is more likely that they were like, "Oh my gosh, we're in trouble. Let's make this up." And that they basically made up this story one last time, these kind of scheming, conniving brothers, in their own self-protection to make sure that Joseph doesn't hurt them. And do you notice what the real twist is what they said? Dad said, "Don't hurt us." And by the way, he called us the servants of his God. I'm like, if you're Joseph, you're like, that's going to make me cry again. Are you kidding me? You guys have been so evil this whole time to me. Now you're going to invoke our God in protection over you? But what's incredible is that Joseph has truly forgiven them. He has forgiven them. And he says to him again, "I have forgiven you. I am not in the place of God. It's not my job to judge. It's my job to extend forgiveness. Last week we said forgiveness is both a crisis and a process. And we saw last week he had the crisis moment where he forgave them. He made the choice to release them from the debt that they incurred when they wounded him so deeply. But now he's being reminded of that injury again, and he has to decide, I know I had the crisis, but what am I going to do now in the process? Am I going to live out the ongoing process of forgiveness? And he chooses to do it, but again, it comes at the same cost we saw with the crisis. He weeps again. It's such a good reminder for us that the process of forgiveness can be just as painful as that initial choice, that crisis of forgiveness. We will always be reminded of what those people did that hurt us, and it will continue to cost us something to release them from that debt. But Joseph does it. He reassures them, I have forgiven you. I will continue to forgive you. You are safe in my presence. And then he makes one of the most profound statements on the character of God that we find in the whole book of Genesis. It's an incredible affirmation of faith. He says in verse 20, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is being done, the saving of many lives. In the New American Standard Translation, the Bible that I first read when I became a follower of Jesus, and I can remember first reading this story, the way that I kind of memorized it was, the NIV says, you meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. And a few weeks ago, one of our kind of main big ideas for the day was that we observed in the life of Joseph that pain and problems do not signal the absence of God's presence. That God was with Joseph, even when he was in the pit and even when he was in the prison. But today I think we can take that proclamation of faith one step further in what he says to his brothers. Because today what he's actually saying is that God providentially allows pain and problems to achieve his purposes. And Joseph has a perspective on the character of God to embrace now this theological reality of providence in his life. Providence is the theological term that basically affirms that God is active and involved in the life of his creation. I remember when I first kind of learned the definition of providence, I remember catching that like in the word, I feel like the two definitions of providence are kind of embedded in the word. That providence is provision, meaning it's God's ability to see ahead. It's his ability to see the end while he's still at the beginning of something, to know what is coming. Almost like my son is able to sometimes see ahead in the film and know what is coming. But it's not enough to just see ahead. We might be able to predict the future sometimes and see ahead. Providence is also his providence. It's his ability to provide in advance what is needed for God's will to come to pass, to make provisions for the events to come. Years ago, I remember some friends hiked the Appalachian Trail, and long before Amazon delivery and all that, if you wanted to hike the Appalachian Trail from Maine all the way down to Georgia, you had to pack up all of your provisions in advance and put them in boxes, and you would ship them to post offices all along the trail, so that when you got to that city, you would leave the trail, go to the post office, and your provisions that you had shipped months in advance would be waiting for you, all these dried goods, and you'd pick them up. And the only way you could make that journey is if in advance you had provided for yourself. In a sense, that's what God's provision is. In his providence, he knows what we will need before it happens, and he's putting these provisions there for us. Providence means God is able to see the end from the beginning and provide for his people in the gap in between. I think it's appropriate that we get introduced to the concept of provision from a Hebrew boy like Joseph. Because I don't know if you know this, but the Hebrew language reads right to left rather than left to right like English does. And so there's a sense in which providence is a Hebrew word that has to be read backwards. If you have a Hebrew Bible and you pick it up, you don't start where we would start on the left-hand page. You flip it over and you start on the right-hand page. The same way a little kid might start a mystery book by just wanting to read from the backwards forwards and see what happens, The old joke about what do you get when you play a country song backwards? You get your truck back, you get your dog back, you get your girlfriend back, right? All the things you lost in the country song, when you play it backwards, you get them back. That's kind of how the Hebrew scriptures work for us as English speakers. Is like, wait a minute, we're starting at the end and going back to the beginning? Well, that's kind of how providence is. It's as if you're reading a story from the end back to the beginning in order to understand the details along the way. And so now Joseph is able to look back on his life through the lens of God's providence, and he's able to kind of affirm new truths about God's character and new truths about how God works. 3 significant lessons that he's going to state to his brothers that are still applicable and valuable for us today. The first thing that he says to them is this, his first lesson: you sold me, but God sent me. This comes out of the text we read last week in Genesis 45, where he said to them the first time they came for, and he had forgiven them, I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there's been famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and no reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then it was not you who sent me here, but God. 3 times Joseph says through the lens of providence, God sent me. This is not about you selling me. This is about God sending me. That is the point of all these events that have taken place. God sent me here so that I could help save the nation of Egypt from starvation and in turn extend that same salvation to my family that will become the nation of Israel. That sending is what saves Joseph's family. And that's still how God works today. This is language that I've heard TD and Callie use several times in here, that each one of us have been sent out into the world by God to join in his redemptive work. The places that you live, your neighborhoods, the places where you work, the places where you play or create or socialize, you are not there by accident. You have been sent there. You have been sent there by a God who loves sending his people out into the world to be part of his work in saving the world. And so regardless of the circumstances that led you there, part of providence says we embrace the reality that wherever we are, we have been sent there. Even if it was because of an evil action in the past that led us to the place we are, we believe God sent us to that place to be a blessing. And the call in our life is to flesh out the life of Jesus, to incarnate the life of Jesus in those spaces every day, to help make the kingdom of God visible so that those other people could be part of God's saving work. We are all sent. We have already been sent. We don't have to wait for a fresh call, a fresh sending in our life. It's not just missionaries who go to foreign lands who are sent people. We are all sent people, and God wants to use us in his redemptive work. The second lesson that Joseph kind of offers to his brothers is this: what you did was evil, but God used it for good. God worked through the brothers' evil intentions to accomplish something good. This is probably the best Old Testament illustration of what eventually Paul will state or declare in kind of propositional truth form in Romans 8:28, a verse that probably many of us have memorized or heard, maybe even have written in our homes. Romans 8:28 says, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose." The brother's action was evil, but God's goodness was able to redeem it. And this is the power of God. This is like the divine alchemy of God, that he can turn evil into good. This is what the redemption of Jesus is all about. That the most evil, unjust moment in the history of the world, the divine creator, the sinless one who enters into the world to love and serve and bless his creations, is put on a cross for crimes he never committed. That the creations crucify the creator in the most painful torture experience that they knew at that time. That was the most evil thing in the history of the world, and yet it becomes the action that redeems all of us. The most evil thing became the most beautiful, glorious thing. That's what God does. That's the power of God's providence, is his ability to turn evil into good. And if you just look back kind of on Joseph's life again and just watch his story as if you're re-renting the film and going, let's look at all these details that we thought were extraneous or purposeless or meaningless, that all of a sudden in the end we realize, oh, Oh, that was all essential. God worked intentionally. I mean, just look at his career path, to use that kind of modern day language, right? Here's a man who eventually is going to need to be prepared to be the second in charge of the largest nation in that region, in the ancient Near East. So how do you prepare a man for that sort of leadership? Well, first you have to acclimate him to a new culture, because he's not Egyptian, he doesn't speak Egyptian. And so initially, when he comes and is taken into the land of Egypt, he's taken on by a man named Potiphar, who trains him and mentors him and teaches him the language, and eventually gives him a small little responsibility to run the household. And then through a variety of circumstances that we talked about, he ends up out of Potiphar's household in the prison. And then in that prison, he's given the responsibility by the chief warden to run the prison. He's being faithful in these little things, being prepared to lead the big things. If your ultimate career profession is going to be in royalty, in working in the Pharaoh's presence, how do you learn about that culture? Well, look what God did along the way. He gave him access to mentors who understood the royal government. He's mentored by basically the director of Egyptian Secret Service. That's who Potiphar was. And then he's mentored by the director of the criminal justice system, the chief warden of the royal prison. And then while he's in prison, he has the opportunity to learn the customs of Pharaoh from the royal butler and the royal chef who are in prison with him. And then through all of that, not just the external realities, but who do you need to be in order to remain faithful to God when God elevates you to position? Well, you have to have your character refined. And so God has been refining his character through these incredible trials. He was falsely accused of rape and sexual harassment, and yet he didn't lose his faith in God. He was overlooked by his colleagues. Even after he interpreted their dreams, they forgot about him, and yet he remained faithful to God. He's been betrayed by those closest to him, his brothers, and yet he learns to forgive those who hurt him the most. So it's not just external things that God is doing, it's an internal reality. And then after all of that preparation, one day he's called and summoned before Pharaoh. And his response to Pharaoh, to faithfully say to Pharaoh, I can't interpret your dream, but God can. And this is what God is saying. That leads him to be promoted to the highest office that he has already proven he's capable of fulfilling. I mean, for Joseph, it must have felt like a 20-year waste of time. And yet, you look back and go, oh, it's actually not a bad resume. It's not a bad resume for being the vice president of Egypt. That's pretty incredible. While he was in the pit and stuck in a prison, it was easy for Joseph to think, God is not here, my life is being wasted. It would have been easy for him to have a bad attitude, to say, I'm not believing in that God my father talked about. If he was real, he wouldn't let this happen. He didn't do any of that. All along the way, we've heard him being faithful to God, talking about God, honoring God, and being loving and humble enough to serve others in that waiting. I just think there's such a good lesson for that for us in this city, especially many of us, not many of us, I'm not, but many of you who are in the entertainment industry. I mean, the first lesson I learned when I moved to Hollywood was that the Hollywood industry is broken, that there is no discernible path to success. I remember being like, what do you mean? They're like, well, if you're a lawyer, you intern, you move up, and eventually you get promoted and you get a good job. If you're most jobs like that, there is a discernible path to success. There is no discernible path to success in Hollywood. The most talented people get overlooked all the time. People with no character get promoted and get jobs and fail massively, and you think, how did they ever get that job? How did they ever get that job over me? It's such a broken, unjust industry in so many ways. And so it's so easy, I think, for people who are in this industry to feel the injustice of being stuck in a pit, in a prison, so to speak. And yet here's Joseph living out this life, being faithful to God, even while he's waiting, staying connected. He's not bitter. He doesn't just kind of numb out, and he stays connected to God, even in those evil circumstances. And eventually, he gets the perspective that God was working through all of it. And this is why I think that's so important. And I've been going through like a significant challenge professionally in my own life last couple of years. I pastored local churches for 20 years, and through some painful events decided to step down from that. And honestly, TD and Callie were the first to reach out and say, hey, you can come heal at Media City. You can just sit in the back. We won't need you for anything. We'd love to just have you and your family here. And then slowly over time, as we built a relationship, he said, man, we'd love to have you help a little bit. When he asked me to do this, I said, man, I'm honored, but And he said, no, I think, and so I've been on my own journey in the last 3 years of kind of waiting for what's next and asking God what's going on. And I'll be honest, in the waiting, there's such a temptation. I use the phrase numb out, basically meaning like to not stay present, to think this is wasted, this is stupid. Life will start again when I get my next job. And until then, I'm just going to kind of kick it and wait. And I had a man in my life who gave me this phrase that stuck with me that I don't think he even understood, but he just kind of spoke it over me. He said, winter may last for a season, but spring can come in a day. And he said, and on that day when spring comes, you're going to be really glad that you were faithful through the winter to prepare for what's coming. And I had this image of like a farmer. Like if you're a farmer and you ask farmers like, oh, do you love the winter? It's like time off, right? You're probably just kicking it, watching sports. They're like, no, are you kidding me? That's the time I do all the repairs to my equipment. That's the time I have to buy all my new seed. That's the only time I get that's downtime, so to speak, to do all the work that's built up during the harvest season. And if I don't do any of that, then when spring comes, I'm not ready to plant. I remember thinking, I'm in a season of winter, but God is not saying, hey, shut it down, numb out, check out. God is saying, stay faithful, stay prepared, because one day spring is going to come, and you're going to need to be ready. And one day spring comes for Joseph, and his character is ready for the challenge that comes before him. You don't get to go back and go, oh, okay, all right, this is what was going to happen. I see it. All right, can we run those 3 years back? I think I kind of want to make better use of that time. It's like, no, that time is gone now. But Joseph has been serving God faithfully during that time. He's been embracing the pain and problems of life, recognizing that they have some value. The third lesson that Joseph is offering for us even today is this, that God's dreams are bigger than personal success. God dreams of using his people to bless others. The big mistake in that initial interpretation of Joseph's dream was that it was all about Joseph. I mean, Joseph had kind of a sense of pride of like, oh my gosh, one day all my brothers are going to bow down to me. That's going to be great for me. I wonder what that means. Am I have some sort of honor or prestige or glory over them? That's what triggered the brothers to be so jealous. Was they're like, who do you think you are? What's going to happen to you in your life through this dream that makes us want to step before or worship you, so to speak? We get to the end, we realize, the dream was not about Joseph at all. The dream was that God was going to use Joseph to bless others. And it was easy for the initial interpretation of a dream given to someone to think, this is what God is saying to me, about me, for me, and to miss the fact that at the heart of God's dreams for us, it's often not about us. It's about how God is building us, shaping us, placing us, sending us for the benefit of others, for his work in the world around us. And that Joseph's real greatness comes from the fact that he is saving the lives of thousands of people, not that his brothers are bowing before him in this moment of honor. So often, I think our dreams and our callings, they involve others much more than we think. And so often, I think the reason that God doesn't bring our dreams to fruition or bring our hopes and reality quicker is because God wants to involve other people along the way. When Joseph he blessed Potiphar by helping run his house. He blessed that chief cupbearer by interpreting his dream and restoring him. Now he's blessing thousands of people in Egypt as well as his family. It's not about Joseph. And when I pastored a church in Ecclesia that gathered in Hollywood, about 80% of our people were in the entertainment industry. And so often I would hear these stories of young men and women who moved from the Midwest or the South or other parts of the country, and they came here because they would say, God put a call in my heart. He's put a dream in my heart to go to Hollywood. And if you kind of played out that a little bit and said, what does that sound like? What does that look like? It always kind of ended up being, I'm going to be successful and going to land some big shows, and I don't know, I don't need to win awards, but I'll definitely be a significant working actor. And then once I have this incredible platform of influence, man, I'm really going to make a difference for God in the kingdom. And I'll be honest, I have friends who have incredible platforms of influence. And I hear them on podcasts, and I hear them on late night, and I text them, and I go, you are continuing to be faithful. You are sharing the love of Jesus. Your character is so pure. I love what you're doing. Keep it up. That may be your calling, but for the majority of people, it's not. And I had these conversations with young actors and writers, and And I say, what if God's call in your life, what if the dream he put in your heart was not about blessing you, but you being a blessing to others? And what if the best way for you to do that is not for you to succeed? It's for you to be stuck in the pit of Hollywood, to be stuck in the career stagnation, the prison that so many people are in, grinding and grinding and grinding and never getting the big role. And yet, your calling is to live differently than others who complain and are frustrated, to backstab. What if your life in the midst of all that is to be selfless and generous and encouraging to others around you? What if the best way to witness to Jesus is to join others in their pit and in their prison and to love them in a way that no one else is loving them in this industry? Is your dream still valid if that's the outcome of it? If it blesses others but never blesses you in the way you thought it would? Because that's what God is doing in the life of Joseph. It is more painful for Joseph to have his brothers kneeling before him than he ever could have imagined when he had that dream. The real blessing of the dream is that all these people are still alive. I love clinging to this idea of thinking that we are not the only ones who have dreams waiting to come true. You know, if you read the New Testament, book of Revelation, you realize that God himself has dreams that have not come true yet. God has dreams for his physical creation that is currently groaning because it is not the way it will one day be. He has dreams for each one of us as human creations, that he has an image of who we will be like Christ that we will never fully experience on this side of heaven. He has dreams for the civilizations, for the nations of the world, that we would reflect his love, his justice, his goodness. But none of those dreams will fully come to fruition until that final redemption day when Jesus returns. And I honestly believe that many of our dreams are like that too. That God gave them to us. We don't have to question them. We can hold on to them, but we can also trust and realize that they will never fully be fulfilled until the age to come when God's kingdom comes to earth, when heaven comes to earth and God fully rules and reigns, and we join him in that. And on that day, we will express the creative calling that we have, or the leadership calling that we have, or the relational connections that we've always longed for. It won't be until that day that that dream finally comes true. And I believe that the message of the New Testament is that we can say with confidence that Jesus' followers, they always go from the pit and the prison to the palace because of the promise of heaven. Jesus will say in John 16:33 to his disciples, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." And we may never see our career palace on this side of Jesus' return. We may never be elevated to a place of honor. We may never find the job that we feel like perfectly fits our strengths and our gifts and our calling. We may never feel like we have the impact that we dreamed of having, or even that we sensed God was calling us to, until ultimately on that day. And so we are invited in the in-between to not wallow in self-pity or to not kind of disconnect from God and feel betrayed, but instead to lean into him and say, prepare me for that day. What can I do today to be prepared for that day that I know will come? God is providentially working through the pain and problems of this broken world to achieve his eternal purposes for us. I was thinking about this message of providence and in some ways realizing that if you only think of providence in terms of understanding God's work by looking backwards, then providence is kind of a toothless idea. It's kind of like, honestly, you can go read tons of self-help books. You can go read any sort of non-Christian spiritual books down at Barnes & Noble that basically say that the key to life is, hindsight is 20/20. And the way we understand is by looking back, and we have to gain perspective on life, and that we have to let years go by, and then one day it'll all make sense. You don't need to follow Jesus to believe that. What is unique about following Jesus, and what is unique about trusting God's providence, is the reality that we don't have to wait to look back in order to find value in our pain and problems. God's providence doesn't just give us a perspective on our past. It's offering us a perspective right now on our present and our future. It offers us an insight, a way of thinking about present troubles, because we can cling to the fact that we know God will one day work all this together for good. Real insight comes from trusting God's foresight, not just waiting to learn from hindsight. And so we get to live today in light of that day when we will one day see how God worked it all for good. We'll be like me sitting in my recliner watching that movie over again going, oh my gosh, it was there the whole time. How did I miss that when I watched it the first time? And as followers of Jesus, we know how the story ends. Every one of us, through faith in Jesus, has a story that will lift us out of the pit, out of the prison we may feel stuck in, and eventually put us in our Heavenly Father, the King of Kings' palace, in his perfect presence when he establishes that kingdom of heaven on earth. I'm going to invite our band up, and let me just kind of close with a personal story. And my wife and I were trying to debate whether I'd shared this before, which probably means that I haven't, because if we didn't remember, you won't remember it. So even if I have, bear with me. But in 2012, after pastoring at a local church in Virginia for 10 years, I felt a call to leave this kind of comfortable job in this big mega suburban church environment with a home, and we felt God's call to go to Brussels, Belgium as church planters. And part of that meant that we would have to get a missionary visa and figure out how to do funding. And there was so much excitement from our local church that one of their own, a young college kid who had met Jesus in a fraternity house and then been an intern and then been on staff, that after 10 years of serving, God was sending him to a new environment. And so people were really excited. And there was even this kind of dream, this momentum building that I would become the global missions pastor and I would stay on staff. And I would just serve from Brussels. And our senior pastor had this idea. He loved it. He was sharing with others. And I liked it because it meant I didn't have to fundraise. So I was like, oh, you'll just pay me a salary? And it meant we could go quickly. If you know anything about me, I like doing things quickly. I tend to talk fast, move fast. I like making decisions fast. And I thought, this is it. This is how God's working. I'm going to be the global missions pastor. And then one day I went to a meeting where this was proposed. And all of a sudden, my senior pastor didn't advocate for it. He didn't put any weight behind it. And the elders all went, nah, we're not going to do that. And I felt so betrayed. I felt so like, wait, what? No, this is not how the dream's supposed to work. And I came home, and I was upset. I felt betrayed. I felt like, wait, God, this is, you called me to this, right? This is our dream together. Why are you pulling the rug out from underneath us? And I remember my wife and I, kids were asleep. They were young. We were sitting at the kitchen table. And I was mad, and I was rejected, I was confused, I was angry. You remember that sermon on lament? I was protesting. I was like, God, this is not what's supposed to happen. I don't understand. This is now going to take forever. I've never had to raise funds. And then somewhere in the midst of this anger, as it kind of like all got out of me, I just sensed the Holy Spirit just kind of whispering this perspective to me. And I don't take any credit for it, but at one point I kind of looked at Krista and I said, this is crazy. We've actually been here before in our marriage. Like, we've been at this moment where we can't understand how God's going to work in the future, and we've been super anxious and sometimes even scared and angry, and every time it's worked out. And every time when we get to that day, we look back on this day and kind of feel bad about how faithless we were. We kind of feel shame that we didn't trust God more. And I just said to her in this simple phrase, what if we just chose to live this day like it is that day? What if we just chose to trust right now that that day is coming? 250 individual people stepped up and wanted to be part of our team. 50 of them came and visited us in Brussels and got exposed to church planting in a post-Christian environment and got a whole new imagination for what the church could look like. I thought this dream was about me. I thought it was about God blessing me with this fun new calling. And instead, he brings all these other people into my life. But he had to slow it down so that others could get involved, so that the blessing could extend beyond. The invitation of the Christian life is to live the future in light of God's providence, to choose to live this day as if it is that day when all will be revealed, to make sure that we have no regrets on that day of how we acted, that we didn't waste time in the winters, that we trusted and remained faithful along the way, that we served God day in and day out, trusting that one day it'll all make sense. That's the invitation for us today. Let's live today as if it already is that day and trust him in the time in between. Our liturgy at Media City is to finish our message each week with just a moment of silence to let God speak to us and to maybe even turn what God might say to us into an I will statement, a declaration of faith that we will live differently in light of these truths. And so let's take some moments now to let God speak to us and to direct our lives as we go forward.